The sun cast a warm glow over the bustling streets of downtown Atlanta as Layla Thompson stepped off the city bus, her sneakers scuffing against the concrete. At 13, she was petite for her age, her slender frame wrapped in a faded hoodie that had seen better days. Her dark brown eyes sparkled with a mix of determination and nervous anticipation as she clutched a thick envelope close to her chest. Inside it lay over 2 years of savings, birthday money, earnings from babysitting gigs, and modest art awards she'd won at local community centers. Each bill and coin represented her dreams of attending a prestigious art school, a future she envisioned with every stroke of her pencil. The towering facade of Crescent Bank loomed ahead, its glass doors reflecting the vibrant city life that pulsed around it. Layla had passed this building countless times, often peering through its pristine windows, imagining the world inside. Today, she wasn't just an observer, she was stepping into that world. Her father, Charles Thompson, had always emphasized the importance of financial literacy. Despite his demanding role as the chairman and CEO of Crescent Bank, he believed that understanding money was a crucial life skill. He had encouraged Layla to open her own savings account to learn the value of managing her finances. But Layla, ever the independent spirit, had chosen to embark on this journey alone, wanting to surprise her father with her initiative. As she approached the entrance, Layla took a deep breath, steadying her nerves. The bank's interior was a symphony of modern elegance. Marble floors gleamed under soft recessed lighting, and the air was filled with the muted hum of financial transactions and polite conversations. The scent of polished wood and fresh paper lingered, evoking a sense of order and sophistication. She joined the queue, her fingers tightening around the envelope. The line moved swiftly, and soon she stood before a teller. The nameplate on the counter read, Sandra. Sandra was a middle-aged woman with sharp features and an air of brisk efficiency. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a tight bun, and her blue eyes scanned Layla with a fleeting glance before settling on the envelope in her hands. "Good afternoon," Layla began, her voice steady but polite. "I'd like to open a savings account and deposit this money, please." Sandra's eyes flicked from the envelope to Layla's youthful face, her expression neutral but her gaze lingering. "Do you have a parent or guardian with you today?" she asked, her tone professional but lacking warmth. Layla shook her head, her braids swaying gently. "No, ma'am. I wanted to do this on my own." Sandra's lips pressed into a thin line. "I see. May I ask how much you're looking to deposit?" Layla carefully opened the envelope, revealing the neatly stacked bills and coins. "It's a little over $6,000, she replied, her voice tinged with pride. A flicker of surprise crossed Sandra's face, quickly masked by her professional demeanor. "That's quite a sum for someone your age," she remarked, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Where did you acquire this money?" Layla's posture straightened, sensing the subtle shift in the atmosphere. "I've been saving for a couple of years," she explained. "Birthday gifts, babysitting, and some art awards." Sandra's gaze remained fixed on Layla, her fingers tapping lightly on the counter. "I'll need to verify this with my supervisor. Please wait here." As Sandra walked away, Layla felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She was aware of the scrutiny she faced, the unspoken questions hanging in the air. Growing up as a young black girl in Atlanta, she was no stranger to the assumptions people made based on appearances. But she had hoped that here, in this bastion of professionalism, her intentions would be met with the same respect afforded to any other customer. Minutes felt like hours as Layla stood at the counter, the weight of the bank's opulent surroundings pressing down on her. She could feel the eyes of other patrons grazing over her, some curious, others indifferent. The rhythmic tapping of keyboards and the soft murmur of conversations seemed to fade into the background, leaving her in a bubble of anxious anticipation. Sandra returned, accompanied by a man in his early 40s. His name tag read Greg, Assistant Supervisor. He was tall, with a neatly trimmed beard and an expression that was both authoritative and scrutinizing. "Miss Thompson," Greg began, his voice smooth, but carrying an undertone of skepticism, "I understand you're looking to open a savings account with a deposit of over $6,000? Layla nodded, meeting his gaze with unwavering resolve. "Yes, sir." Greg exchanged a glance with Sandra before continuing. "That's a significant amount for someone your age. Are you sure this money is solely yours?" Layla felt a flush of heat rise to her cheeks, a mix of embarrassment and frustration. "Yes, sir. I've saved it all myself." Greg's eyes narrowed slightly. "Do your parents know you're making this deposit?" Layla's heart pounded in her chest. She had wanted to do this independently, to show her father her initiative. But now, that decision seems to be backfiring. "My father is aware that I've been saving," she replied carefully. "I wanted to open the account on my own to surprise him." Greg's expression remained unreadable. "I see. Please wait here for a moment." As Greg and Sandra stepped away, Layla's mind raced. She felt the weight of judgment in their questions, the insinuation that her actions were suspicious. The confidence she had walked in with was beginning to erode. The moment Ava Collins stepped into the grand lobby of Hamilton Trust Bank, she carried with her more than an envelope of cash. She brought dreams, determination, and a deep belief in the dignity of earning. At 13 years old, the daughter of banking mogul Leonard Collins wasn't there to make a statement. She was there for something far more personal, to deposit the very first $5,000 she had ever earned through academic competitions, scholarships, and birthday savings. But instead of being treated like a young achiever stepping into financial independence, Ava was met with coldness, doubt, and quiet judgment that pierced deeper than words. The initial warmth she had carried with her began to fade the moment she noticed how employees' smiles faltered when their eyes met hers. Ava had walked in wearing her favorite navy hoodie, faded jeans, and a pair of worn sneakers she'd grown attached to. Her appearance was deliberate. She didn't want anyone to know who she was or what her last name could open. She wanted to experience the bank like anyone else, a regular customer with real money and honest intentions. Ava joined the line, envelope in hand, watching the flow of customers come and go. Some were waved past the queue. A white man in a sleek business suit was ushered directly into a private room, no questions asked. A middle-aged couple, perhaps immigrants from Southeast Asia, were brushed aside with a gesture toward the waiting area, their faces showing quiet confusion. A Latin worker was met with probing questions when he tried to cash a simple check. Ava's eyes narrowed as she realized what she was seeing wasn't randomness. It was a pattern. Still, she kept her composure. She reminded herself that her father had taught her patience and resilience. She believed in fairness. She believed that banking was about trust and service, not appearances. But when her turn finally arrived, nearly 40 minutes after customers who came in after her had been helped, something in her heart began to ache. She stepped forward and greeted the teller with a bright smile. "Hi, I'd like to deposit this into my savings account." The teller, a young woman named Kelly, stared at the envelope. Then, slowly, her eyes drifted up to Ava's face and then down to her shoes. The warmth that Ava had tried to bring to the moment was met with a wall of skepticism. "Where did you get this money?" Kelly asked flatly. Ava blinked. The question wasn't what she expected. "From math scholarships and gifts from my birthday. I've saved up for months." There was no reaction, no smile, no nod of understanding. Kelly called over another teller, Matt. He walked up slowly, arms crossed, his gaze already heavy with doubt before he'd even heard a word. He glanced at Ava, then at the envelope, then exchanged a look with Kelly. "That's a lot of money for someone your age," Matt said, his voice drenched in presumption. Ava felt a sting, sharp and unexpected. Her confidence wavered for just a moment. "Yes, it is. I've worked hard for it. I have an account here. You can verify. But verification wasn't what Matt and Kelly were after. What they wanted, clearly, was justification. Why did a girl like her, dressed like that, have $5,000 in cash? And beneath that unspoken question was a harsher implication. Could she be trusted? Is this money really yours, or are you helping someone else? Matt pressed on. The question made her stomach churn. It's mine, Ava said again, her voice more brittle now. Everything in that envelope is mine. Matt leaned in, speaking to Kelly, but loud enough for Ava to hear. It might be dirty money. We need to verify more than just the account. The words hit her like a cold wind. Dirty money. A criminal accusation whispered like it was routine. Ava clenched her fists at her sides. She looked around, suddenly aware of the eyes on her. Customers nearby had turned their heads. Some looked curious. Others are indifferent. And some, she could tell, looked just as skeptical as Matt and Kelly. Ava wanted to scream, to cry, to lash out, but she didn't. She remembered what her father had told her countless times. The strongest voice is often the calmest. If you need to verify the deposit, go ahead, she said with quiet defiance. But do it the same way you do it for anyone else. Her words hung in the air, unacknowledged. Kelly began typing into the system, slowly, eyes darting toward Ava every few seconds. Matt stayed close, arms still crossed, his posture more that of a bouncer than a banker. And then, without explanation, they called over a supervisor. Her name was Barbara. She looked down at Ava the way a teacher might regard a student accused of cheating. Her presence didn't bring comfort. It brought escalation. Sweetheart, Barbara began, her voice syrupy but insincere, this seems like a large deposit. Perhaps you should consider going to a different branch, one better suited for this kind of transaction. Ava's face flushed. Why? This is my bank. This is my branch. Barbara tilted her head. We have the right to deny service if something seems suspicious. Suspicious. That word again. As if it were a veil for all the judgment they couldn't say outright. Ava breathed deeply, her mind racing. Should she tell them who she was? Would that end the humiliation? Would it solve the problem or just prove their point that respect had to be earned through power? She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't threaten. She just said, I'm calling my father. Barbara's eyes flickered. Matt stepped back instinctively. Kelly froze. Ava pressed a number. 3 rings. Ava? Everything okay? Leonard Collins' voice was calm but attentive. Ava's voice was firm. They won't let me deposit my money, Dad. They think it's suspicious. They think I don't belong here. There was silence on the other end. A silence Ava had never heard from her father before. And then, a quiet, measured fury. Put someone in charge on the phone, he said. Ava handed the phone to Barbara. The woman's confidence crumbled as she brought the phone to her ear. Her eyes widened, her spine straightened, and then her face went pale. In that moment, the lobby of Hamilton Trust Bank turned from a place of authority into a courtroom of reckoning. Matt and Kelly stood frozen. Customers started murmuring. The quiet shame that had been Ava's alone now spread to every corner of the lobby. Barbara handed the phone back with trembling hands. We apologize, Ms. Collins. Please proceed. But Ava didn't move right away. She stood there, letting the silence do its work. She looked into the eyes of each person who had doubted her, who had seen her hoodie and her skin before they saw her intelligence, her discipline, her humanity. No one should have to prove who they are to be treated with respect, she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Not in this bank, not anywhere. And with that, she stepped forward, placed her envelope back on the counter, and watched as Kelly's fingers fumbled through the deposit process. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just stood tall, because being judged before being heard had taught her something vital, not just about banks or bias or society. It had taught her about herself. She had power, and now she knew how to use it. There are moments in history that arrive quietly, disguised as ordinary seconds, until they swell into something unforgettable. For Ava Collins, that moment didn't come with fanfare or fireworks. It arrived in a bank lobby amidst murmurs and glances, on the weight of a silence too heavy for a 13-year-old girl to carry alone. What had begun as a simple errand to deposit scholarship, money had spiraled into an interrogation rooted not in policy, but in prejudice. And now, the tide was about to turn. The air in Hamilton Trust Bank was sharp with tension. Time seemed to slow as Ava raised her phone, her hand steady despite the storm she was weathering inside. She dialed a number she had rarely used for anything trivial, her father's direct line. Not because she couldn't call him, but because she was raised to fight her own battles. But this was no ordinary battle. This was not about inconvenience or even poor service. This was about being seen as less than, simply for existing in a space some deemed she didn't belong. When Leonard Collins answered the call, the composure in his voice cracked through the heavy atmosphere. "Where are you?" he asked, his tone already alert. "I'm at your bank. They won't let me deposit the money into my account," Ava replied evenly. She didn't need to shout. Her words did the heavy lifting, carrying every ounce of truth. On the other end of the line, Leonard Collins stood from his chair so quickly his assistant startled. Within minutes, the executive boardroom on the top floor of Hamilton Trust erupted into movement. Security camera feeds were pulled up. Legal advisors were summoned. The bank's president and CEO was no longer just a corporate figure. He was a father who had just discovered that his daughter had been denied dignity in his own institution. Back on the lobby floor, silence spread like fog. Customers stopped mid-transaction. Employees froze behind their counters. Kelly, the teller who had doubted Ava from the beginning, now paled visibly. Matt, who had mocked the origin of her money, swallowed hard. And Barbara, the branch manager who had dismissed Ava without hesitation, stood stock still. Everyone had heard the words, "I'm calling my father, Leonard Collins." Even before he arrived, his name sent shockwaves across the marble-tiled lobby. To the customers, it was gossip turned reality. To the staff, it was Judgment Day. And to Ava, it was no longer about proving herself. She had already done that. Now, the responsibility was on them, to answer for what they had done and what they had allowed. When Leonard stepped through the doors, flanked by the bank's COO and two members of the board, he didn't need to announce himself. His presence, tall and measured, radiated control laced with fury. A father's fury, yes, but also a leader's, one who had built a company on values that had just been publicly shattered. He walked directly to his daughter, placing a hand on her shoulder. Ava stood tall, her chin lifted, not in pride, but in resolve. The room waited, breathless. "Who is the manager on duty?" Leonard asked, his voice calm but piercing. Barbara stepped forward, her lips trembling. "That would be me, Mr. Collins." He gestured toward the private meeting room near the lobby. "Let's take this inside, now." The door shut behind them with the weight of finality. Inside, Barbara tried to offer a defense, a flimsy list of procedural excuses and vague references to employee concerns. Leonard listened, unmoved. "Do you know what today was for my daughter?" he asked, his voice quiet, yet full of emotion. "It was her first financial milestone, something she's earned through academic excellence, discipline, and pride. And your team turned that into a moment of public humiliation." Barbara lowered her gaze. She couldn't deny the truth. The security footage showed everything. How quickly Ava had been judged, how differently she had been treated compared to others, how she had been made to feel like a criminal for depositing her own money. Leonard didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "You don't just owe my daughter an apology. You owe every customer you've ever treated unfairly an apology. Because this isn't just about Ava. This is about the culture we allowed to grow unchecked. And starting today, that changes. He stood, opened the door, and walked back into the lobby. Employees stood in a half circle. Customers watched silently. Ava remained beside the counter where her ordeal had begun. Leonard turned to face them all. "I am deeply ashamed of what happened here today," he said. "As the chairman of Hamilton Trust Bank, I take full responsibility for the actions of this branch, but I'm not here to make excuses. I'm here to make change." He paused, locking eyes with each of the three employees, Kelly, Matt, and Barbara. "Effective immediately, you are relieved of your duties. Your actions do not reflect the values of this institution." Gasps echoed across the room. A customer whispered, "He's serious." Another nodded. "He should be," Leonard continued, his voice steady. "To those of you remaining, understand that silence is not neutral. If you stood by and said nothing when you saw unfair treatment, you are part of the problem. But today, you have a chance to be part of the solution." He gestured toward Ava. This young lady reminded all of us what courage looks like. She stood alone when others wouldn't. And because of her, we're going to rebuild something better. Not just a better bank, but a better standard of how we treat each other. Ava's eyes met her father's. She didn't need words. The quiet nod they exchanged was more powerful than any applause. That day didn't end with just firings and apologies. It ended with the beginning of something deeper. Customers approached Ava, thanking her. A middle-aged woman leaned down and whispered, "My daughter went through something similar once. I wish she had been brave like you." The COO announced an internal investigation, and the board immediately approved emergency measures to audit the treatment of customers across all branches. A new department, Customer Equity and Advocacy, was greenlit that very afternoon with a clear directive: identify discrimination where it exists, eliminate it, and build systems that prevent it from returning. Outside the bank, media had already begun to gather. Rumors had leaked, and within hours, headlines would fill the internet. Bank chairman's daughter humiliated at his own branch. The public reaction would be swift and fierce. But inside the bank, where it all began, something extraordinary was unfolding. Employees were hugging Ava. Customers offered nods of respect. And for the first time in a long time, something unfamiliar yet hopeful filled the space where shame had once lived: accountability. As the afternoon sun dipped low, casting long shadows through the tall glass windows, Ava stood by her father on the steps of Hamilton Trust Bank. Her journey had not been meant to make history, but sometimes history comes looking for the quiet ones who simply refuse to stay quiet. And on that day, a 13-year-old girl changed everything. The aftermath of the public reckoning at Ashton National Bank was not just a media storm. It was a moment of reckoning that cracked the surface of an institution long shielded by tradition and prestige. The incident had pierced through the polished veneer of corporate perfection, exposing the festering prejudice hidden beneath policies, protocols, and polite smiles. And at the epicenter of this upheaval stood a 13-year-old girl who had refused to stay silent. Days after the confrontation, the city buzzed with opinions, analysis, and outrage. News outlets dissected every second of the incident caught on video. Social media amplified it to the world. Talk shows debated whether this was an isolated failure or a systemic rot embedded deep within the financial industry. But within the walls of Ashton National's headquarters, the noise outside was dwarfed by a deeper, more pressing silence: the silence of responsibility. Robert Ellison, chairman and CEO, sat in his office on the 42nd floor, overlooking the skyline of a city he had once believed he fully understood. The same city where his daughter, Zoe, had been reduced to a suspect simply because of how she looked. His hand rested on a report summarizing the public reaction, internal employee sentiment, and early signs of customer distrust. Each line was a wound. Each metric signals that this moment would define his legacy, not as a financier, but as a father and a man. He had built this institution to be powerful, respected, a symbol of American financial excellence. Yet what good was power if it protected prejudice? What value was prestige if it humiliated the very people it claimed to serve? The pain in his daughter's voice during that phone call still echoed in his mind, clearer than any earnings report or strategic forecast. And so, he made a decision. Tear it down, he told his executive team at the emergency board meeting the next morning. His voice didn't tremble, but the room did. Not the walls or the brand, but the culture, the assumptions, the silent permissions, the excuses. We rebuilt from here, from this scar. No one in the room dared challenge him. His face, usually composed with executive detachment, was raw with purpose. Diane Mercer, Chief Operations Officer, nodded gravely beside him. She had reviewed the internal audit. The problem wasn't just with a few rogue employees. It was systemic. Discrimination had been allowed to pass as discretion. Bias had been mistaken for caution. And silence had been institutionalized as professionalism. The first action came swiftly. Every branch, starting with the flagship where Zoe had been humiliated, underwent a mandatory cultural audit. Customer-facing practices were recorded and reviewed. Independent investigators interviewed employees, clients, and even former staff. What emerged was devastating. Patterns of delayed service, unverified assumptions about financial capacity based on race or attire, and a corporate culture that favored image over empathy. Within a week, the bank issued a public apology. But this was not the standard, carefully worded press release. Robert himself stood before a sea of cameras and spoke not as a CEO, but as a parent. My daughter was denied dignity in the very institution I swore would protect it. That failure is mine, but it will also be my greatest catalyst for change. He announced the immediate termination of all employees directly involved in the incident, including regional manager Sheila Whitmore, who had stood in silence as the situation unfolded. But he didn't stop there. He declared a full-scale restructuring of Ashton National's values and operations, what he called the Ashes Reform. The reform had 5 pillars: accountability, equity, transparency, empathy, and community. Each pillar would be embodied in new programs and structural overhauls. For the first time in the bank's 80-year history, a Customer Equity Council was formed, composed not of executives, but of customers from diverse backgrounds. Their role was not symbolic. They held power to review complaints, recommend policy changes, and issue formal reviews of executive conduct. A new internal watchdog division, Fair Serve, was also created. Its purpose, to anonymously monitor employee behavior at all levels, especially in frontline branches. Each employee was required to undergo empathy training, not once, but quarterly. These were not checkbox sessions. The content was designed with psychologists, civil rights educators, and real customers who had experienced discrimination. Staff were asked to step into simulations where they experienced the same biases they may have unconsciously expressed. Beyond internal change, Ashton National took a bold step by opening a financial equity education fund. It allocated millions to nonprofit organizations focused on financial literacy for marginalized communities, particularly Black and Latino youth. It partnered with local schools to offer banking and entrepreneurship mentorship. For Zoe, this was the part that mattered most. She had been taught by her father that power meant little if it wasn't shared. The reform, however, was not met with universal applause. Within the bank, Some longtime employees grumbled about the abruptness, claiming it created fear and unrest. A few anonymous voices leaked to the media, calling it an overreaction, a move. But these voices were quickly drowned by the wave of customer support, thousands of messages from people who had never imagined a bank would take accountability so publicly. Zoe herself, though still young, became a quiet force behind the scenes. She met with the Diversity Council members, asked questions, and shared her experience without bitterness. Her story inspired others to step forward. A Muslim woman shared how she had once been asked 3 times to remove her headscarf at another branch. A transgender man recounted being refused a loan despite perfect credit. These voices were no longer buried. They became the foundation of the change. In a private journal entry, Zoe wrote, "I didn't want to change a bank. I just wanted to be treated fairly. But maybe when one person says enough, it gives others permission to say it too. Maybe that's how we start." Robert, reading her words late one night, felt a tear trace the edge of his cheek. He had always believed in numbers, projections, scalability. But in this moment, it was his daughter's quiet courage, not his capital, that had shaken the foundations of power. Months passed. Ashton National's reputation, once teetering, began to stabilize. Other banks took notice. Some followed suit, initiating their own internal reviews. A few tried to dismiss it as a one-time spectacle, but customers knew better now. They asked questions. They demanded transparency. The industry, as resistant as it was to moral reform, began to shift ever so slightly. Inside the main branch, where the humiliation had begun, things looked different. The marble still gleamed, the counters were still polished, but now there were new faces behind them, a more diverse team. Employees trained not only in finance, but in humanity. Every customer, whether depositing $5 or $5 million, was greeted with the same warmth. There were no more judgmental glances, no more silence mistaken for service. Zoe visited again unannounced. She wore the same hoodie, the same shoes. No one recognized her, at least not at first. A new teller smiled warmly and said, "How can I help you today?" No hesitation, no suspicion, just professionalism, just decency. And as she left the branch, a small smile played on her lips. The wind rustled her braids. The sun glinted off the glass of a building that had once made her feel small. Now it reflected a different story, one where even the biggest institutions could bow their heads, admit their mistakes, and rise again, not in shame, but in strength. Zoe didn't change the world alone, but she had sparked something. And from the ashes of that injustice, something better had begun to rise. In the quiet hush of an early morning, sunlight spilled through the glass towers of downtown Chicago, gilding every surface with golden warmth. Outside the sleek headquarters of Silvergate Financial, the media had already begun gathering. Journalists with cameras, microphones, and pens buzzed with anticipation, lining up near the marble steps of the building where something unprecedented was about to unfold. Inside, however, the atmosphere was hushed, solemn, and resolute. A historic announcement was imminent, and at its center stood a girl who once entered a bank simply to make a deposit and in doing so exposed a truth so glaring it forced an entire industry to look at itself in the mirror. Aliyah Bennett, now composed and visibly matured by recent events, stood in front of her bedroom mirror. Her simple navy dress and polished shoes reflected a sense of quiet power, a far cry from the girl who had walked into the bank weeks earlier wearing a hoodie and sneakers. Today, she was not just a student, not just the daughter of a bank chairman. Today, she was a symbol. Her face, calm, intelligent, determined, had appeared in newspapers and news channels across the country. Yet Aliyah remained grounded, focused on what truly mattered, that this moment must lead to more than headlines. It had to mean transformation. Downstairs, her father, Christopher Bennett, waited in the foyer with Diane Everett, the bank's chief operating officer. The two had spent weeks working through reform proposals, listening to stakeholders, hosting internal reviews, and facing the firestorm that erupted in the wake of Alaya's experience. They had terminated employees involved in the incident, overhauled leadership at multiple branches, and, perhaps most importantly, built a council led by both employees and customers to oversee equality in service delivery. But none of that meant anything if they failed to show the world what came next. As Alaya descended the staircase, her father looked at her, pride welling in his eyes. Not pride in her name or family line, but in her conviction, her refusal to shrink in the face of discrimination, and her insistence that the bank be better. Diane nodded respectfully, signaling it was time. At the grand auditorium of Silvergate Financial, a vast banner hung behind the stage. Its message, simple yet profound, read, "Every voice counts. Every customer matters." Executives filled the front rows, joined by policymakers, community leaders, and representatives from advocacy groups across the country. Among them were people who had also faced quiet humiliations in banks. Some denied loans despite good credit, others questioned unfairly, many simply ignored. Today, they were not just observers, they were witnesses to accountability. As the crowd settled, Christopher Bennett stepped to the podium. He didn't begin with defense or justification. He began with acknowledgement. "A few weeks ago, my daughter walked into one of our branches to make a deposit. What should have been a simple, dignified experience became an act of public humiliation. She was doubted, questioned, and insulted, not because of anything she said or did, but because of how she looked. Because someone believed that a black girl couldn't possibly own what was rightfully hers." His voice remained calm, but each word carried weight. This wasn't just a failure of customer service. It was a reflection of the invisible biases that still plague our society and, yes, our institutions. He paused, scanning the room. "And I want to say clearly, we failed. But we are not here to cover up that failure. We are here to learn from it and to build something better." Applause rippled through the room, not the kind that comes from politeness, but from deep, shared recognition. Then, with a nod, Christopher stepped back and invited Alaya to take the stage. She approached the podium slowly, her steps steady, her presence magnetic. The cameras focused, lenses zoomed, and the room stilled. "I didn't come here today to relive the moment I was judged," she began, her voice clear. "I came because I want that moment to mean something." She scanned the audience with grace. "When I was questioned at that counter, when they looked at me like I didn't belong, it hurt. Not just because it was unfair, but because I knew it wasn't just about me. I knew there were thousands, maybe millions, of people who had felt the same thing in different banks, different places, different ways. And most of them didn't have someone who would listen when they spoke up." A few heads bowed quietly. Others nodded. "So I decided I wouldn't stay silent. Because silence is what keeps injustice alive. It's what allows systems to stay broken." I spoke up, and thanks to my father and this team, something began to shift. She took a breath. "But it's not enough to fix one branch. It's not enough to make statements. We need real action." That was the cue. Diane Everett returned to the stage and unveiled a digital presentation, a new slate of policies not just for Silvergate, but proposed as a model for the entire industry. These included the immediate launch of a customer equality and advocacy unit, an independent body to oversee complaints of bias. Every transaction at every branch would now be anonymously monitored and evaluated. Employees would undergo immersive anti-discrimination training, not as a checkbox, but as a recurring cultural re-education. There would be a national hotline staffed 24/7 by a diverse team empowered to investigate and escalate discrimination claims. Bonuses and promotions would now be tied to fairness metrics, not just financial performance. But perhaps the most innovative initiative was the establishment of the Youth Advisory Panel, a diverse group of young voices, including Alaya, empowered to review customer experience and represent a generation often ignored in financial conversations. The announcement made waves across media platforms. Silvergate wasn't just apologizing, they were rebuilding from the inside out, and they were doing it under the guidance of the very person who had been wronged. In the days that followed, Alaya appeared on several national platforms, not as a celebrity, but as a symbol. Her calm demeanor, articulate reflections, and unwavering focus on systemic change captured the public's imagination. Letters poured in from people who saw their own experiences in hers. Parents told stories of how they used her example to teach their children about courage. Community leaders reached out asking how to launch similar efforts in their regions. One afternoon, weeks after the press conference, Alaya returned to the same branch where it all began. This time, she wore no hoodie or cap to conceal her identity. She walked in confidently, not with defiance but with quiet assurance. The lobby looked different, not in appearance, but in energy. Employees greeted every customer with genuine warmth. A Latina woman at this counter smiled as she helped an elderly man deposit his pension. A young Asian college student opened a new account without unnecessary questioning. The atmosphere was open, respectful, and intentional. Alaya approached the counter where a new employee stood. "Welcome to Silvergate," the woman said. "How can I assist you today?" Alaya smiled. "I'm just here to observe and to say thank you." The woman looked surprised. "Thank you?" "For showing me things really can change," Alaya replied. Outside, as she stood on the sidewalk, she looked back at the building and felt something new. Not relief, not victory, but hope. A hope rooted not in empty promises, but in real, tangible action. A hope she knew had to be protected, nurtured, and expanded. Back at home, Christopher found her journaling. "You still writing everything down?" he asked. She nodded. "It helps me remember why it matters." "Do you think we've done enough?" he asked. Alaya looked at him thoughtfully. "We've done something, but we've just started." She paused. "The real test isn't in how loud we speak when people are watching. It's in how fair we are when no one's looking." Christopher nodded slowly, understanding that his daughter had become more than a girl with a voice. She was now a force, gentle but firm, thoughtful but unwavering. A living reminder that even the smallest spark can light up the darkest corners of power. And from that day forward, every time a customer walked into Silvergate Financial, they stepped into more than just a bank. They entered a place that had been rebuilt with truth, accountability, and the courage of a young girl who once refused to be overlooked. The system had changed because she had dared to challenge it. Final reflection. When one voice shakes a system, from the moment Alaya Bennett turned 13, she walked into a Silvergate Financial branch with a simple goal: to deposit money she had earned legally. Something much larger than a financial transaction began. A spark was lit, a spark that would spread across the heart of an industry too comfortable in its silence, too blind in its bias. Alaya's experience, though painful, became the thread that would unravel decades of systemic injustice woven into the fabric of everyday organizations. Alaya's experience, painful and humiliating as it was, became a thread that unraveled decades of systemic injustice woven into the daily fabric of a revered institution. What began as a normal moment for a young girl, clutching the fruits of her labor and her dreams, turned into a national reckoning. We witnessed a system that had failed her in real time, as the subtle mechanisms of discrimination, the stares, the questions disguised as formalities, the veiled insults, played out boldly and without remorse. It was more than a moment of misjudgment. It was a mirror holding up the face of society. And in that reflection, we all saw something uncomfortable, undeniable, and urgent. Our institutions are not as fair, progressive, or evolved as we would like to believe. The story of this story is not about injustice. It's about what Alaya didn't run. She didn't explode in rage or, well, voice. She demanded her rights, not just those who had let her down. Her calm defiance, measured in her ability to maintain grace under fire, has become a symbol, not just for young people of color, but also those who have been pushed aside. But the real story of this story is not about injustice. It's about what happened next. Alaya didn't run. She didn't explode in rage or sink into despair. Instead, she stood. She used her voice. She demanded her rights, not just to be treated with dignity, but to hold those who had let her down accountable. Her calm defiance, measured courage, and ability to maintain grace under fire have become an icon, not just for young people of color, but for anyone who has ever been underestimated, misjudged, or pushed aside. When her father, Christopher Bennett, president of Silvergate Financial, walked into the branch a few minutes later, the power dynamics had shifted, but the moral compass of the story had not. It still revolved around a young woman who had faced prejudice and confronted it with the truth. Christopher's response was not revenge, but accountability. He didn't just fire the employee, he broke the complacency of a system he had helped build. And with that, the real work began. The bank's boardroom, previously reserved for discussions of quarterly profits and goals, transformed into a space for reckoning and reform. The conversation shifted from shareholder returns to social responsibility, anti-bias training, accountability measures, fair hiring, community councils. These were no longer bullet points on a brochure, but lifelines in the bank's new vision. And Alaya? She went from victim to voice. She joined the Financial Fairness Council not for recognition, but for change. She used her position not to condemn, but to educate, not to tear down, but to rebuild. Her work inspired a national conversation, forcing other organizations to look inward. Schools began using her story as a case study in ethics. Banks rewrote their internal codes of conduct. News outlets called her a changemaker. But Alaya stood firm, sticking to her original intention, to make sure no one else had to feel the way she did, powerless, unheard, unseen. This story reminds us that systemic change doesn't start in boardrooms or government offices. It starts in everyday places, with ordinary people who refuse to accept the status quo. A bank teller's desk, a teenage girl's courage, a father's determination, a community's cry for help. When these things come together, transformation becomes inevitable. But perhaps the most powerful lesson from Alaya's journey is this: change is not convenient. It is not neat. It is not polite. It is not comfortable. Real change is painful. It is disruptive. It breaks things down before it rebuilds them. But it is in this discomfort that we find the seeds of a better world. What is the story? We take it personally. We examine how we treat others, not just when the world is watching, but when it's not. We challenge ourselves to see our own unconscious biases and correct them. We stand up when we see injustice, even if it's subtle, even if it's inconvenient. We empower the voices of those who have been silenced. We model what it means to listen deeply and act boldly. In our daily lives, we can apply Alaya's lessons in simple yet profound ways. As employers, we can rethink how we hire, evaluate, and promote. As consumers, we can support businesses that practice inclusivity. As educators, we can teach our students not just about history, but about dignity. As parents, we can raise children who know their worth and know how to honor the worth of others. And above all, we can remember that it takes only one person to ignite a movement, one girl, one voice, one act of courage. If Aliyah Bennett could turn a moment of humiliation into a national shift in values, then so can we. Each of us has a sphere of influence. Each of us can challenge, create, and lead. This isn't just her story. It's ours too. It's a reminder that behind every policy, every corporate slogan, and every customer interaction, there are real people with real dreams. And those dreams deserve respect. So if this story moves you, if it makes you pause, reflect, or see the world a little differently, don't let that feeling fade. Use it, share it, act on it, because every view, every comment, every subscription on this channel helps amplify voices like Alaya's. Stories like this deserve to be told, and more importantly, they deserve to be heard. Subscribe to the channel to keep these stories alive. Hit the like button if you believe in dignity, equality, and the power of one person to change the world. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it because change always begins with awareness. Together, we can continue to shine a light in dark places. Together, we can hold accountable institutions. And together, we can build a world where no one is judged by their appearance, but honored for their truth. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And thank you for being part of the change.